I grew up in New England, and I thought the way to handle things is repress for success.
Repress for success? I've not heard that before.
Well, it's good reason. It's because you're very evolved. And
No, it's because I'm British, and it's just innate in us.
You don't even have to think about it.
I'm Joanna Coles. This is the Obsessed podcast, and here is what I'm obsessed about. In fact, you can see how obsessed I am by this new book, From Mistakes to Meaning, because of all the post-it notes in it. It's a book about people who make mistakes. I've got my own mistake in there too. But it's how you learn from them, how you move forward, and how you learn more about yourself and what caused you to make the mistake in the first place. And I'm here with the two authors, Michael Lynton and Josh Steiner. Josh is an investor. He's now an author. Michael ran the Sony studio when they went through the Sony hack. And that's really the biggest mistake probably in the book. It remains, I think, the largest corporate hack in American history. But let's get into it. I'm so pleased to talk to you about your book, From Mistakes to Meaning.
looks like you actually read it.
I did read it.
That's the surprising part.
Yeah, I did not make the mistake of having you come in and not have read it. But what's fascinating about the book is that these are real mistakes. They were catastrophic mistakes to both of you. And this is not one of those books where it's like, my biggest mistake led to the best thing that ever happened to me. These were catastrophic mistakes. In your case, Michael, the biggest hack in American corporate history, the Sony hack. And in your case, Josh, it led to you going through a series of select committee hearings and being interrogated, basically, when you were in your 20s. I mean, I read your section of the book and I winced for you. I felt so awkward reading it. It made me feel like I was in my 20s all over again.
You're referring to the story?
No, I'm referring to the
because you're actually a serious editor, and I thought of you wincing is unappealing. I want to be really clear.
No,
this is when you say something nice about the prose. Go ahead, Joanna.
No, it's a beautifully written book.
Oh, there we go. We got around to it eventually.
There you go.
Thank you.
But Michael, talk about your mistake first. I've known you for a long time, so I knew about the mistake, but I had no idea of how you had processed it and also what you felt led to it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I should start by saying when Josh approached me, because this was his idea originally to write a book about mistakes, the whole point to your comment about, humble bragging, that was not going to be allowed. That both for our own stories, but as well as the people whose stories because we interviewed a lot of people, Malcolm, yourself, others in the book, that the whole point to it was to actually that they be real mistakes with bad consequences.
Yep.
Where nothing good has come of it, so no humble bragging. In the case of my own mistake, which has been, documented in the past, what happened was there was a movie, The Interview, with Seth Rogen as the star, where at the end of it, they assassinate Kim Jong-un. It was a comedy. And in a weak moment, I greenlit the picture. It was one of these things where in the normal course of events at the studio, we had this very strict procedure and process where we would bring together a group of individuals, somebody from finance, somebody from marketing, and we would all opine on the picture, and there would be a profit and loss statement, and legal would be there giving you the risks and elements, and you'd have a decision. In this particular moment, because in truth, everybody else at the studio, for the most part, wanted to make the movie, but also because we were in a competitive situation with Universal, we decided that we do a read-through, and at the end of the read-through, and I normally didn't attend read-throughs because I was always the suit. I was the guy who was sitting in the background trying to make sure that nobody went off the rails. But in this case, I had to be in the room because we had to make the choice. We would go forward. So in that moment, for a reason that I'll get onto, I didn't want to be the parent. I didn't want to be the cop. I didn't want to be the person who said no. In fact, what I wanted to do was be with the cool kids, meaning Seth Rogen and James Franco and all those people around having a great time reading the script. So I said, yes, let's do it when the reading was over and everybody was cheering and saying how funny it was. And nothing good came of that.
Well, and also what's fascinating about it is that you talk about you were the guy whose job it was to say no. You'd built a process where studios, and Sony had been losing money before you got there, studios you had built the guardrails and then you smashed straight through the guardrails, and it was the sense of your own wanting to belong, to be one of the cool kids, as you say. But what I found fascinating about your chapter is you track your desire to want to be one of the cool kids, because you'd always felt on the outside. And as someone who knows you and has worked alongside you, we're both on the board of Snapchat together, I was very surprised by that, because you seem to be the consummate insider. You always know everybody. You have an incredible kind of contacts book. And it gave me an insight into somebody I thought I knew, which I had really no idea about.
Right. And all of that, what you do, as you describe me, I can understand how people who know me well, and you know me well, think that. But really what happens, and this is in the course of our writing the book, we went through a process which we can get onto, which you really discover about many mistakes, this one in particular, is that it comes from something that you basically develop really as a kid. So in my case, I was moved to Holland by my parents when I was 8 or 9 years old. I moved from the United States. I didn't speak any Dutch. And the next few years were really lonely for me, at least the next couple. And what I developed as a result of that is a deep desire to belong. I really wanted to be with a cool group of kids. And yes, I made friends. By the way, some of those people are still my close friends.
Some of your friends are quite cool.
Some of them.
Okay,
You are.
Whoa,
You are.
I'm a little insulted here.
Fair enough. No. Okay, I've evolved since that
Okay.
point. But I had this, this way of seeing the world. And it traveled with me over time. And it comes upon me occasionally, not always. But in this particular moment, when I was sitting there in that room, it sort of came up inside of me, and it was in fact, I think it was the impulse that caused me to do this. And I had not really understood that until we went through the process of this book. I had really, the minute this thing went down, meaning the hack and all the rest, I wanted to bury it and never look at it again.
So before we come on to Josh's story...
We can go on Michael's as long as you like, Josh. I'm totally comfortable.
Oh, Josh, you're next
I'm
one
totally comfortable.
Well, I just want to remind people how devastating the Sony hack was, because it's 15, 16...
No, it was a decade ago. It was
Decade
exactly
ago,
10
okay.
years ago.
So can you just remind people, I don't want you to relive it, but just relive it briefly for us.
Yeah, I mean, there was a whole lead up to it. We put out the first trailer of this movie I mentioned earlier in June, and we started getting warned, it turns out, by the North Koreans that we shouldn't be putting this out. But then finally in the fall, when they did hack our systems, and I discovered in the morning driving to work, they wiped out 70% of our computers. So everything was brought to a standstill. They hacked out all of the emails, but not just all the emails, because up on our systems was also movies like The Karate Kid that we were about to release that they put up on the internet. They put up on the internet the new script for the James Bond movie, which was very confidential. And they put out all of these salacious emails from all over the studio, which had a lot of correspondence with movie stars and agents, which the press picked up on, and that made it a big media event. And it went on for months. So we were crippled as a business for a period. And secondly, we just stayed in the news forever because of all this material. And it was really the first public example of a major cyber attack on an American company.
All right, so let's come back to it and how, interestingly, the president responded to it, because in many senses it could have had a different outcome, because it was an astonishing thing that a foreign government would attack an American company, and whether or not actually the response was adequate. But Josh, let's go on to your mistake, which was keeping a diary, which shouldn't in any way feel like a mistake. But, you describe your mistake.
So I was 28 years old, and I was chief of staff at the Treasury Department in Washington. And as part of the Whitewater investigation of the Clintons, my personal diary got subpoenaed, along with all the other records. And all this seems kind of quaint, I would say, in the context of what's going on in Washington today. And I complied with the subpoena and turned over my diary. And in that diary, I had described aspects of the Whitewater investigation and the special counsel's role. And as a result of that, I got called to testify before Congress and the grand jury. And got a lot of really quite unappealing press coverage as a result of it. So part of what Michael and I had to do was figure out where was the mistake within what seemed like at least 17 choices, because the diary was the focal point. And there's no question that what I wrote in the diary was just dopey. To your point, people keep diaries regularly in politics, and they play an incredibly useful role in helping historians understand what's happening. But when you're in Washington in that context, you shouldn't be writing about sensitive investigations. And if for some reason you should do it, you should be doing it incredibly carefully. So the kind of diary I was keeping was certainly wrong, as well as keeping it at all.
Well, and you start with a moment that I read and just sort of broke out in hives for you, which is
You look much better now. So obviously you didn't read it recently.
Well, and happily you've recovered from your mistake. Where you're on the shuttle going from New York to DC, you open the paper, you're in a tiny little seat, so you've got the paper sort of folded up, and to your horror, you start reading about yourself and your direct front page of the New York Times, which is always one of those things that people say to you in corporate life. Never put anything down that you don't want to see on the front page of the New York Times. And you did. But
where were you when I needed you, Joanna? Because it's really useful now, but it would have been even more useful, I would say, 30 years ago.
But a lot of people will read your mistake and think, why on earth did you own up to keeping a diary? Everybody's entitled to have personal correspondence. Why would you volunteer it up? And there's a moment in the diary, which is I think, the sort of before and after, where you actually rip a page out of the diary because you're thinking of giving the diary to them and you're taking out the incriminating page. And then you realize you can't do that and that you need to do the right thing. Can you just talk us through that moment?
There's so many moments to choose from, and each of them is less appealing than the other. So let's just be clear about that.
Okay,
so
we're using humor as a defense. I can see how humor has been built over the years to deal with it.
Well, it's a little bit true, although there's just not a chance that before we started doing this book together and without Michael's help, I would be here talking about it at all. Just no way. So look, there are two things. One is that New York Times moment that you described. And I think part of the reason that we wrote this book together was, well, fortunately, most mistakes don't land themselves on the New York Times. Everyone makes a mistake at some point where they feel as if that spotlight of attention is on them.
All right, but let's just go back to the bit where you rip out the page.
So I want to be clear, though, that this New York Times moment is important for us, and that's why we wrote about it so vividly. There's no upside to that story. There's no heroic moment where I then rushed out and dragged people out of a plane that was on fire and turned it into a heroic moment. And this book is full of those moments. That's number one. So the question about the page. So I get my subpoena. I go home and I'm concerned about whether there was anything in it. I read my diary and I find that there was. And I rip it out and think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to turn this over. This is full of things which are really unappealing in terms of the light in which they cast the administration. And
and they're unflattering about your boss.
And close friends. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so I think I'm not going to turn that over. And then I have a sleepless night and I realize, no, that's just not a choice. I had done something really dopey, which was write about a sensitive matter in my diary. But the law was super clear. The subpoena was super clear. You have to turn over anything, whether it's personal or professional, that relates to this investigation. And there's a big difference between doing something dopey and breaking the law. And I woke up and realized, no, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to obey the law. I wish I hadn't done this, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life feeling, I would say, terribly guilty about having broken the law. That just wasn't a choice.
But then one of the things that happens to you is that you, in trying to remain loyal to the people you're working for and your friends, begin to step away from some of what you have written. So you then get pilloried for being a man who writes a diary in private and then says, oh, well, I didn't really mean what I wrote in my private diary.
Right. That word pilloried, I'm trying to think if I know the definition of that word. Yeah, I think I do, and I don't think it's so appealing. So I was in a bind, right? So I think many people keep diaries, and what they write in those diaries is not meant to be a perfectly precise account of what happened during their day. They're talking about their emotional reaction. They're using shorthand. So on the one hand, my diary was not a perfectly accurate account of events that were complicated. And in some cases, I'd written about them long before. On the other hand, exactly to your point, I should have said, yeah, that's what I wrote. It's about right. It may not be perfect, but it captures the spirit of what was going on. And I felt in this box between trying to be as precise as possible because I was under oath and I had an obligation to be as precise as possible. I definitely had a desire to be loyal to colleagues, and I felt very badly about the fact that I had taken an action which had cast them in a bad light, and I don't think I handled it well.
Well, you were also in your late 20s. I mean, now you might handle it differently, but what is so acute reading your section is how young you were and how devastating you felt the consequences were.
Well, a really important part of this effort was trying to unpack these mistakes. And so one thing we should just get into for a minute is we realized as we went through it, we all think of these mistakes as a decision. It's a moment in time. I write it down in the diary and that was the mistake. Michael greenlights the movie. That's the mistake. And that's a decision and you need to own that decision. But a lot happens before you make that decision. That's Act 1. Michael's references to his childhood. That's an important part of what happens. Act 2, do you understand the environment? I'd kept a diary when I was traveling around Asia. I shouldn't keep the same kind of diary when I'm in Washington. That's happening in Act 2. I wasn't aware of my surroundings. And then really importantly for both of us, and we think for many people, is Act 3. How do you handle what happens afterward? And so in my case, the whole issue was I grew up in New England and I thought the way to handle things is repress for success. Like your emotions just aren't your friend.
Repress for success? I've not heard that before.
Well,
Right.
it's good reason. It's because you're very evolved and
No, it's because I'm British and we don't even, it's just innate in us.
Whoa. Just
You
for a
don't
moment.
even have to think
Okay,
about it.
so we could turn to the section in your chapter where you said, wait, I'm British. I don't have emotions. Because in our interviews of you, we asked you to describe your emotions and you denied even feeling anything. So it's exactly the same thing.
Okay, well, we'll come on to my mistake.
Okay, but all I
in
was
a
going
bit,
to say, Act
in a
3
bit.
was about repression.
Right. Well, and I want to come to the psychology of it all. So, because this was particularly hard for you too, because in the hack, your personal family emails, your medical histories were all made available for people. So devastating for your family and for you personally as well as professionally. So when the two of you came together to face these mistakes, you've been having walks. It was COVID, and you came to the realization you both needed still to get past these things. Talk about the process of how you did that and then bringing in a psychologist to help you.
Well, first things first. So Josh and I were taking a walk. Josh had been thinking about this for a little bit. He presents the idea to me to say, I'd like to write a book about mistakes. I'm not quite sure about how we would do it, but you have mistakes. I have a mistake that I really want to discover or really unpack. He was making a distinction between failures and mistakes, which was an important distinction for me to understand.
Right. And just let's explain that to people, because that's a good part in the book too, the difference between a failure and a mistake.
So very quickly, if you look at a newspaper article where someone's done something dopey, they use the word mistake and failure interchangeably. In the first paragraph, mistake, and the third will be failure. We actually think of failure and success as siblings, because in both failure and success, a group of people, usually together, have a plan and they have some ambitious goal and they work on it. And then the only difference is the outcome. In one case, it works out, and in the other case, it doesn't. But in both cases, usually people feel pretty good about the effort because they were trying to do something meaningful. Our definition of mistake is very different. It's something that you generally do by yourself, where you're unaware of your emotional state, you're unaware of your surroundings, you make a decision, and it leads to regret. And there's no happy outcome. This is not, I only made $500 million. My plan was to make $1 billion. There's none of that. And so a shorthand that we thought about was we use the word failure for marriages. Marriages fail. And why is that? It's because two people come together. They plan to spend their lives together. They're serious about it until death do us part. And then it doesn't work out. It's a failed marriage. But there was a serious effort to do something meaningful. If you go to Vegas and you have 6 cocktails, and you then propose to the cocktail waitress, and then you stagger down to the Elvis Chapel, and you get married, the odds are very high that you're going to think that was a mistake. You weren't aware of your emotional state. You didn't know really where you were. And then you make a decision, and then it leads to regret. And this book is about mistakes. This isn't about groups of people coming together with some ambitious goal where then leads to a failure. It's the things we all do every day when we're not aware of our emotional state. We make a mistake, and then it leads to regret.
Okay, so Michael, talk about having the psychologist involved and how you learned to go back through your childhood and understand that it was you as an outsider and longing to be an insider that made you the guy that could throw up your hand after the reading and pump your fist and say, let's make this?
Yeah. So, I described to you how this all started out, and then Josh and I started trying to write about mistakes that we had made, different ones than the ones we actually wound up in the book. And there was a point in time where we suddenly realized, okay, if we're going to be interviewing other people and we're going to be trying to understand how this all works, it's probably a good idea to get an expert in the field, or at least somebody who understands, an academic who understands what we need to be reading and what the process is. So Josh found a wonderful psychologist, a professor at Johns Hopkins, Alison Papadakis, who was our partner in all of this. And while we went through it, she did a couple of things. Firstly, she allowed us to understand what was the academic literature behind a lot of these ideas, and those are presented in the book extensively. But the other thing she did was she, in the case of our own mistakes, but also as we looked at other people's mistakes, she was the one who sort of helped us unpack and really got us to go deeper and deeper and deeper. Because every time you think you're getting to the root, to the base of it, there's probably another level. I mean, one of the things we talk about in the book are these Russian nesting dolls, the ones where you keep on opening it and there's another doll and another doll. And that, Alison, was enormously important to the process, because she was the one who sort of gently pushed us to go in that direction. And that's ultimately how I got to the conclusion that I came to.
We also needed to get out of our own heads. Like there's an effort sometimes when you do this kind of work to think this is all about you and it's so interesting and your story is so fascinating. And very quickly, as intrigued as we were about our own stories, we wanted to do something broader, because this book is not about two guys and their own mistakes, although that's an important element. We very quickly decided that we wanted to interview super successful, charming, attractive people. Oh, so for example, you. And we wanted to get other authors like Malcolm Gladwell. We wanted to get people from the music industry like the late great Irv Gotti, and then people who aren't well known but had made meaningful mistakes. And as Michael said, as soon as we broadened the group of people beyond ourselves, the story just became much more interesting. And she was indispensable in helping us uncover, as Michael said, those underlying stories and thinking about the literature and help frame these things in a broader context than just about ourselves.
Well, and also what's interesting about it is that these are mistakes you both made that people wouldn't necessarily know about you. Like, I knew about yours because it was incredibly public. I didn't know about yours because it had happened
I'm
in
so
your
glad I wrote the
20s.
book then.
Right, well, now everybody knows. Everybody knows. But most people would look at the two of you and think, oh, these are masters of the universe. They've conquered the field they wanted to go into. They were super ambitious. They figured
I like
it out.
this part of the interview better than where you started. Okay, we can just stay on that theme for a while if you'd like.
But my point is that everybody has mistakes and everybody buries them. And what's interesting about the book is A, getting people to admit to it, and B, having a solution for people to work through it. There are lots of academic references, as you say.
Yeah.
But also just the process of trying to help people process their own mistakes. And I will say it was an incredibly intense experience for me when I did a Zoom call with the two of you. And Michael had been saying to me for the last 9 months, I want to interview you about a mistake. And I was being quite flippant.
Would you be
about it.
willing to describe your mistake?
Well, my mistake was not having enough children and not understanding early enough how important motherhood would be to me, none of which I'd really acknowledged until I sat and talked to you about it, except that I wished that I had thought about it earlier in my life. And I grew up at a point where I actually think feminism was doing women a disservice by dismissing the value of motherhood, both emotionally and culturally. And I felt caught up in that. And I also came of age at a time when I was a journalist and I was given incredible opportunities because finally women were allowed in the newsroom and then in the foreign bureaus. And so and it felt very zero-sum that you couldn't do both. And of course, it turned out you can do both, but I only realized that really late in the process. And I had my second child at 39. And if I knew what I knew now, I would go back and I would have 4 kids and I would have started much earlier. And I don't want to blame the culture because, of course, there are people my age who did have 4 kids and have got incredible jobs, but there aren't very many of them. And I didn't know any of them. And all my friends were talking about this is impossible to juggle. No one can do this. And I wish that we had I just wish we'd talked about it more and thought it was more possible. And also, it's a mistake you can't get back. I mean, I could adopt some children now, but that would be kind of strange at my age. But it's irrevocable.
Yeah, you were super generous with us in talking about all the conversations we had about it.
Well, I came off the Zoom feeling like, oh my God, what on earth have I said? I can't believe I admitted all that. But actually, it started me on a process which has been interesting.
That's what we found with almost everyone with whom we spoke, which is to say, we didn't have an idea of what they were going to describe to us. And we said, just tell us about something meaningful. It can't be I ordered the wrong thing for breakfast. And we had no idea, because all we knew about you, besides being, super successful, is that you'd seem to have your whole life together and well organized, and you have great sons, and that all felt pretty well constructed. And so when you told us that, it was a real surprise. And your story was powerful in many ways. And it was true for other people, where it was that intersection between yourself as a very clearly defined individual and your own background in England, plus these much larger societal trends. And for many people, that intersection what's super powerful. Who am I as an individual? How have I made my way in the world? How did I be so successful in Fleet Street? How, in your case, did you become the editor of Cosmo and then running editorial at Hearst? And at the same time all that was happening, as you said, feminists were writing really thoughtful work. There was a whole bunch of popular culture about how professional women were supposed to lead their lives. You referenced Mary Tyler Moore when we spoke to you.
And then you reference Anne-Marie Slaughter in the chapter when you process my interview and write through. And she, of course, raised the issue of, how do you manage to have children and a powerful job at the same time?
And that was true of others as well. And then one of the ways that Alison was so helpful to us is in your chapter, we also talk about concepts like social convoy theory, which is you had left your community, first the community you grew up in England, then that Fleet Street community where you'd been successful as a young person, and then come to New York. And for people who leave behind their communities for good reasons and create new ones, as you've obviously done very successfully, that loss is very powerful. And so one aspect of family is how do we recreate that community around us? And family and community are so vitally important in terms of our well-being.
Well, and I think that when you're in the process of building a community, you can't acknowledge the loss of the community because it's too destabilizing. So you have to sort of look full steam ahead and you just have to keep moving forward. And now I've got a little bit more time to process it. And I'm able to sort of reconnect with some of that community. And I've actually, as a result of talking to you both, I doubled down on talking to folks in the UK more than I normally do. I'm normally quite sparing about it. Well, I normally sort of drip feed it as a great treat or reward. And then I thought, no, I don't need to do that. I can actually build it in much more regularly, which I've done. So it's been helpful. Anyway, so both your mistakes were incredibly public. But you can still feel a lot of shame and embarrassment and self-shame about mistakes you've made. And this is a theme that comes up in the book. Can you talk to it a little bit?
First, it's useful to distinguish between embarrassment and shame. So you're embarrassed when other people see you do something that you regret. So you get invited to a party and you show up wearing a tuxedo and everyone else is in jeans. It's embarrassing. Shame is very different. Shame is where...
That is such a small... By the way, that is a very small example of embarrassment. I thought you were going to say you turn up at a party, you get very drunk, and you say all sorts of stupid things.
You speaking from experience or projecting?
Definitely speaking from experience.
Checking, no, okay. Because the times I've seen you, you've always been super elegant and well-behaved. So shame is very different, though. Shame is when you think something's wrong with you, and no one has to see that. You just carry that around with you. You think you have a moral failing. You think there's an aspect of your character or personality that you don't like. And that shame stays with you, regardless whether anyone has seen you. And so when you go through something really hard, you can be embarrassed in the first instance. I was on national television. It was embarrassing. But then I can carry shame, which is much deeper. Do I have bad judgment? Did I not make the right decisions? There's something which is really flawed with me. And right after that mistake, and for some period of time, there's something called the spotlight effect, where you think everyone is watching you. You think there's a spotlight on you, where in fact, most people have just moved on with their lives. They just don't care that much. And I carried that spotlight effect with me way too long.
Well, in fact, it even stopped you asking a neighbour to turn his music down because he was so anxious that he would see you as the guy who'd just been in front of the select committee hearing.
It's exactly right. And I'm lying there in bed at 2 a.m. worried about the fact that he might look at me and thought that I had lost somehow my moral authority to turn down the music. And when I went up there to ask him to do it, it's like, oh yeah, he had no idea who I was. He couldn't care less who I was. He was having a good time. He lost track of the time and he happily turned it down. And that's because I was carrying it with me and thought everyone else was as obsessed as I was. No one else cared nearly as much as I did.
But it's very easy for people to get into spirals of self-doubt and shame and then sort of sink down. And actually, I mean, happily, neither of you did this, but you can see how making big mistakes which get played out in public end up with people taking their own lives because it's just too much to
that's
take.
That's obviously in the extreme. But, when Josh came to me with this idea, I had been carrying this around for 5 years. And the minute I thought over, I never wanted to see it again. But by the same token, in that period, I was going into restaurants thinking they see a hack on my forehead, and to Josh's point, nobody could, people have their lives to lead. They had moved on. I hadn't moved on.
Right. Nobody is thinking about you, it turns out. But when you're in that shame spiral, you think everybody's thinking about you.
And it's debilitating. It's completely debilitating. And so the idea of when Josh presented this, like, let's really explore this. At first, I was like, what are you kidding? I don't want to go near that thing. But then I suddenly realized I have to. And once we got into the process and went through it, it was so helpful to me. It was such a relief to actually explore it and get to the bottom of why I did it and realize that the world was no longer thinking of me this way. And that's, at the core of the book, frankly.
There are two great pieces of research which support this. One is obviously work that people have done with individuals who survived serious trauma, and that's exposure therapy. What do? They expose them to the things that had caused them so much trauma. And part of this book was just that. I mean, it was you talking about something that you really regretted, processing it, talking with others about it, and hopefully coming to a greater sense of peace about it. And the second piece of research, which is very relevant and fascinating, they asked for volunteers, and they took them and they gave them a very cold object to hold. And they put them into 3 groups. And to the first group, they said, think of something comforting. Think about home. In the second group, they said, just don't think about the cold. Try not to think about the cold. And in the third group, they said, experience the cold. Really feel the cold. And they had them hold it for 2 minutes. They let go of the object. And then they tested them a few minutes later to see whether the pain lingered. And the group that felt the pain the most for longest was the group that had tried not to think about the cold. And the group that had gotten over the pain the fastest were the ones who had processed the cold while they felt it. And the point here is that when we're going through these mistakes, it's so hard to do, but the more that you can experience it and recognize your emotions and then try to think about what had caused it and then get to the root cause, as Michael had said, unpack it like a Russian nesting doll, the greater the likelihood that it won't stay with you. You'll make fewer mistakes and you won't feel nearly the regret that you did.
Well, and hopefully you have a stronger sense of self-understanding, which precisely stops you making another catastrophic mistake.
Exactly.
Anyway, I cannot recommend your book more highly. It's a very good book, both reading about other people's catastrophic mistakes that really derail them. And again, just to reinforce, this is not about humble bragging. This is not where you say, oh, I made a huge mistake. I sat next to fill-in celebrity and I didn't realize who they are. How many times have we heard that from people? And I embarrassed myself because I didn't realize they had a new movie or a new book at the top of the charts. This is not that. This is a book that will make people feel extremely uncomfortable reading it because you take on the mantle of the mistake being made. But I think will help people process their own mistake.
We hope it gives people permission to talk about it. Yeah. In just the way I assume when you're talking with women now about your own career and their careers, you always talked about these things some, but maybe you'll talk about it even more.
Oh, first thing I do when I talk to young women is, when are you going to have children? You have to think about this and you have to think about it early. And this idea that we've allowed women to think, oh, you can have kids at 45 and it'll be absolutely fine, it's nonsense. And so it doesn't mean it's not possible, and it doesn't mean everybody should have children, but the conversation never happened when I was growing up. The conversation was the opposite. It was like, we don't want kids, we don't need kids, and what a mistake that was. Anyway, Thank you very much for making me confront my own mistakes. Very awkward for me, but I found it a very helpful process. And it's a terrific book. Many congratulations. And also, final note on your friendship. I mean, what a fun thing to do with a friend.
And the other thing I would say about the friendship part of it is it reinforces and makes the friendship even more valuable over time. I mean, one of the things that's said in the book is that this is not something you should undertake on your own. You really need to do it with another person. I obviously did it with Josh and with Allison, but our friendship, which was strong before, it grew enormously as a result of this.
Michael Lynton and Josh Steiner, thank you both very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.